The instant Margaret tried to confiscate my fishing gear was the precise moment she sealed her own downfall. I'm relaxing in my weathered fiberglass dinghy, savoring the dawn fog drifting over Willowbrook Reservoir, when the thunderous rumble of a luxury speedboat shatters the morning tranquility. This gleaming silver vessel charges toward me, and perched at its stern like some aquatic dictator stands this meticulously groomed woman in expensive boating attire, bellowing at maximum volume. "This is restricted waters. Remove that eyesore immediately." The odor of her boat's high-grade gasoline mingled with her overwhelming cologne as she maneuvered alongside my humble craft. The soft rippling of waves against my hull suddenly felt like the quiet preceding a very costly tempest. I simply grinned, took another gulp of my coffee, and replied, "Ma'am, you might want to double-check your documentation on that ownership claim." What would you do if a complete stranger insisted they controlled the water beneath your vessel? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell me your location. I guarantee your area has a Margaret exactly like this one. Let me rewind and explain how I landed in this predicament. My name is Tom Mitchell, and 4 months prior I'd inherited my uncle's modest waterfront cottage after he died at 91. Uncle Charlie had been my refuge after my bankruptcy destroyed everything. You understand how it goes when creditors circle, and suddenly your nest egg vanishes quicker than summer storms. I earn my living as an automotive technician, so I've got grease forever stained beneath my nails, and the type of spine that creaks, like ancient floorboards when I rise each morning. But Uncle Charlie always preached, integrity trumps shortcuts, and sitting on his sun-bleached wooden pier with morning coffee, watching the haze lift from Willowbrook Reservoir, I finally grasped his wisdom. This reservoir, spanning 300 acres of untouched water encircled by mature woodland, served as the town's recreational center during Uncle Charlie's youth. He'd recount tales of annual gatherings, youngsters mastering swimming, extended families celebrating reunions at the community beach. However, throughout recent decades, multi-million-dollar estates mushroomed along the waterfront like costly fungi following precipitation. My cottage appeared completely out of place among such opulence. While my neighbors maintained pristine lawns and boathouses worth more than my entire savings, I cultivated native wildflowers and owned a basic wooden pier secured with determination and marine-grade hardware. Enter Margaret Thornfield. Margaret relocated from the metropolis 6 years ago and immediately crowned herself the unofficial leader of what she renamed Willowbrook Harbor Estates. Imagine a woman approaching her mid-50s who's never encountered an issue she couldn't resolve with paperwork and a patronizing grin. She operates a silver Mercedes that remains more spotless than surgical suites, and I suspect she presses her recreational lake clothing. My initial encounter with Margaret occurred while I was servicing the carburetor on my 1989 base boat. Nothing extravagant, but she performs reliably and transports me to productive fishing locations. The boat's fiberglass hull displayed that authentic weathering of countless hours on water, contrasting sharply with the polished trophy boats secured at costly marinas. Margaret approached my pier wearing ivory slacks that likely exceeded my monthly food budget, her stilettos clicking against the aged planks like a metronome counting down. She possessed that artificially sweet tone wealthy people employ when preparing to devastate your existence. "Pardon me," she declared, consulting her omnipresent clipboard. "I'm Margaret Thornfield, Homeowner Association President for Willowbrook Harbor Estates. We must address your watercraft situation." Her pronunciation of watercraft made my modest fishing boat sound like floating debris. I cleaned my hands on an oil-stained cloth and introduced myself. "Tom Mitchell, pleasure meeting you." "Mr. Mitchell, I'm concerned your vessel violates our community guidelines." She presented an official-appearing document featuring more legal headers than bankruptcy papers. "This constitutes a removal notice. You have 72 hours to eliminate your boat from our exclusive reservoir." I reviewed the elaborate language while she drummed her polished fingernails impatiently. The letter alleged my boat's presence endangered property investments, breached aesthetic requirements, and possibly generated ecological risks. It bore the signature of some legal practice from the district capital with a title longer than my vessel. "Ma'am, I've been fishing these waters since I could barely reach the tackle box," I said, returning her documents. My uncle, I comprehend. Your emotional connections, she interrupted with that expression people wear before crushing aspirations. However, this represents private property now. We've allocated substantial funds maintaining this reservoir's immaculate condition. As she spoke, I detected her expensive fragrance competing with the natural aromas of lake water and evergreen trees. It resembled someone installing a boutique within untamed nature. Unless you comply willingly, Margaret continued, we'll pursue legal enforcement, including boat removal at your financial responsibility. She handed me her business card, ivory cardstock so substantial you could construct furniture with it. Then she clicked back to her Mercedes, abandoning me holding a legal threat in one hand and a greasy engine part in the other. That's when I realized this transcended boat ownership. This concerned whether money could eliminate history, whether communities belonged to those who built them or those wealthy enough to purchase them. Margaret wasted no time escalating pressure. Within days, she'd scheduled what she termed an urgent HOA assembly regarding undesirable influences threatening their lakeside sanctuary. I wasn't included, but information spreads rapidly in tight-knit communities, particularly when affluent residents plot against local working people. She distributed a petition labeled Preserving Our Investment and Community Standards, because nothing demonstrates neighborliness like reducing humans to financial figures. The petition included photographs of my boat, captured from various perspectives, resembling some maritime criminal documentation. She even shared them on the neighborhood social media platform with commentary about declining standards and dangerous precedents. Now, I should clarify something about lakeside communities. They function like school cafeterias, everyone recognizes. Their designated seating area and boundary crossing creates anxiety. Margaret rallied the luxury car owners using scare tactics that would impress campaign managers. What comes next? She posted digitally. Mobile home parks, rental properties, we must respond before our haven becomes public camping grounds. The gossip campaign commenced instantly. Suddenly, neighbors who'd previously waved cordially were avoiding me when we crossed paths. Anonymous grievances materialized at municipal offices claiming my boat leaked fuel. Absurd, since I maintained my equipment better than most people maintain relationships. Multiple residents approached me with apologetic warnings. Tom, we hold nothing personal against you, but Margaret claims property values might decrease 30% if this situation escalates. Here's the reality about intimidators. They depend on their targets feeling isolated and defeated. Margaret's approach followed classic harassment patterns, surround me with legal pressure and social ostracism, until I surrendered quietly. But she committed one critical error. She assumed I was merely some simple mechanic who'd collapse under pressure. Time for my initial response. I devoted my weekend at the municipal courthouse, a dusty brick structure reeking of stale coffee and dashed hopes. The property documentation office occupied the basement, supervised by clerks who'd witnessed every land ownership conflict imaginable. I described my situation to Helen Peterson, a woman who'd been recording deeds before Margaret was born. Willowbrook. Reservoir, Helen's eyebrows elevated like she recognized familiar drama. That's a complex historical situation. She retrieved record books appearing older than my uncle. Their pages had yellowed and become fragile as dried leaves. As we arranged them across the research table, I noticed the scent of ancient ink and paper gradually decomposing. Your uncle, Charles Mitchell, honorable man. He used to bring me vegetables from his garden. Helen traced boundary lines with an arthritic finger. The complication is, reservoir ownership becomes intricate when dealing with natural water systems. Then she revealed something intriguing. My uncle's original property deed contained language about water access privileges and historical usage, rights. Legal terminology that resembled ancient languages, but Helen explained it meant Uncle Charlie possessed rights extending beyond mere shoreline ownership. The major revelation came when Helen mentioned something that chilled my coffee. You know, there was a significant dispute about this reservoir during the 1970s. Multiple ownership challenges, federal involvement, complete chaos. Never received proper resolution, as I recall. Simply got concealed under bureaucracy when developers arrived. She extracted another file container. You should check with the state environmental department. Reservoirs like this sometimes have protected designations that override local property claims. I departed the courthouse with a box of documents and my head spinning with possibilities. Margaret believed she faced a simple trespassing case, but this appeared more like a property rights war that could destabilize her precious exclusive community. That evening, I sat on my pier reviewing the papers while my fishing line drifted in the gentle current. The sun was setting behind Margaret's mansion, creating elongated shadows across water that might not be as privately owned as everyone presumed. My phone chimed with a message from an unknown number. Final warning: remove boat or face consequences. Concerned Willowbrook residents. I smiled and cast my line again. Margaret had escalated from legal threats to anonymous intimidation. In my experience, that indicated her position wasn't as secure as she pretended. Time to discover exactly what Uncle Charlie had been safeguarding all these years. Here's something most people don't realize. Always examine original property deeds. When someone claims exclusive ownership of natural features like reservoirs or coastlines, many private areas achieve that status through documentation manipulation, not legitimate ownership. 8 months later, Willowbrook Reservoir resembled a community celebration brought to life. The morning mist rolled off water, belonging to everyone, once again carrying the sounds of children's joy and the gentle splash of fishing lines touching the surface. The Willowbrook Public Trust had been established with me as the volunteer regional steward, a position that paid modestly, but provided meaning beyond anything I'd ever experienced. Uncle Charlie's cottage had been converted into the community education center, where families learned about water preservation, local heritage, and the importance of protecting public resources. The renovated boat launch hummed with activity every weekend. Reasonable entrance fees, sufficient to fund maintenance and conservation programs, maintained the facilities while ensuring access remained affordable for working families. The aroma of grilling fish from weekend cookouts mixed with the fresh scent of preserved wilderness. What surprised everyone was how rapidly the community recovered once Margaret's divisive presence vanished. Property values actually improved after the legal uncertainty was resolved, and honest homeowners received regional compensation for their developer-caused losses. The shared stewardship model we'd created became a template studied by environmental law schools nationwide. Margaret's outcome was considerably less pleasant. Convicted on multiple regional charges, including harassment, fraud, and threatening government officials, she'd been sentenced to 18 months of community service, the delicious irony of someone who'd attempted to privatize public resources, being compelled to serve public interests. Her bankruptcy proceedings had liquidated everything: the mansion, the speedboat, even the Mercedes that had clicked so arrogantly across my pier those many months ago. Last I heard, she'd relocated to another region, presumably to find a new community to terrorize. Richard Thornfield, meanwhile, had become one of our strongest supporters. Freed from his wife's toxic influence and crushing legal expenses, he'd discovered a passion for environmental conservation and volunteer work with local youth programs. The ripple effects extended far beyond our small reservoir. The legal precedent had been referenced in dozens of similar cases across multiple regions, with federal review identifying over 150 illegally privatized water bodies. Congressional hearings on public trust protection had resulted in new legislation, strengthening community access rights. For me personally, the transformation was profound. The bitter bankruptcy that had nearly destroyed me seemed like ancient history. My new role as environmental steward had introduced me to Dr. Lisa Wang, whose legal expertise had evolved into something much more personal and lasting. But the most meaningful change was understanding Uncle Charlie's legacy. Those stories about the reservoir belonging to everyone weren't just sentiment. They were instructions from a man who'd spent 40 years quietly protecting something precious for future generations. The Charles Mitchell Memorial Scholarship, funded by visitor donations, and regional partnerships had already sent 4 local students to study environmental conservation. Helen Peterson had been our first scholarship presenter, her hands trembling with pride as she handed the check to Carlos Rivera, a young man whose family had been priced out of reservoir access for years. The transformation was visible everywhere: Youth employment programs operated through the education center gave teenagers meaningful work, maintaining trails and teaching conservation. Senior citizens enjoyed new accessible fishing platforms designed specifically for wheelchairs and mobility aids. Families who couldn't afford expensive recreation memberships could spend entire days enjoying nature education programs. But my favorite change was the sound. Instead of the aggressive roar of expensive speedboat engines asserting dominance, the reservoir now hummed with the gentle puttering of small fishing boats, the splash of children learning to swim, and the laughter of multi-generational families sharing the water their taxes had always supported. On summer evenings, I still sat on Uncle Charlie's pier, but now I was rarely alone. The community fish fry had become a weekly tradition, bringing together families from every economic background to share fresh reservoir fish and stories under stars reflected in public water. The smell of wood smoke from our communal fire pit, mixed with the earthy scent of lake water lapping against the shore. Kids who'd never held fishing rods learned from veterans with decades of experience. Elderly residents shared memories with young parents just starting their own family traditions. Helen Peterson, now 89 and still sharp as a fishing hook, often joined me for evening conversations. "You know what your uncle would say about all this?" she asked one sunset, watching children skip stones where Margaret's speedboat used to patrol. "What's that?" He'd say, "You finally learned that some things are worth more than money. They're worth fighting for." As autumn painted the preserved shoreline in gold and crimson, I realized the fight had given me something I'd never expected: a community, a purpose, and the knowledge that ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they stand together. If you've got your own HOA nightmare story, share it in the comments below. Let's expose these petty tyrants together. And don't forget to subscribe for more David versus Goliath stories where the little guy actually wins. Because sometimes the best revenge is simply returning to people what was always theirs. The week before the community meeting, Margaret went completely destructive. Her first desperate action was attempting to have me arrested on fabricated charges. She contacted the sheriff claiming I'd been stalking her property and making threatening gestures from my boat. Sheriff Martinez, a reasonable man who'd known Uncle Charlie, appeared at my pier with an embarrassed expression and paperwork he clearly didn't want to serve. "Tom, I have to ask, you've been bothering Mrs. Thornfield?" "Only if catching bass counts as harassment," I replied, displaying my morning's modest catch. "Want to check my tackle box for dangerous weapons?" Martinez chuckled despite himself. "Look, this whole situation's gotten completely out of control. Just stay visible when you're out there, okay? Witnesses help everyone." But Margaret's legal theatrics were just the opening performance. Her real masterpiece was attempting to bribe the community center's maintenance crew to accidentally double-book the venue with a wedding reception. Amazing how a $2,000 donation to the church building fund could create such convenient scheduling conflicts. When that failed, she hired a crisis management firm from the city to spread misinformation about federal land seizures. Suddenly, social media exploded with warnings about government takeovers and property confiscation. The smell of fear-mongering was thicker than diesel fumes from Margaret's speedboat. Her radio interview was masterful manipulation. Hard-working families could lose their homes to bureaucratic overreach, she declared with practiced sincerity. "This isn't about reservoir access. It's about whether Americans still have property rights." The smear campaign against me intensified. Anonymous flyers appeared throughout the community, featuring unflattering photos of my boat next to warnings about outside agitators and anti-development extremists. My bankruptcy record somehow became public knowledge, with whispered stories about my instability and resentment toward successful people. But Margaret's most vicious move was hiring social media manipulation services to amplify negative stories. Suddenly, every local platform buzzed with comments from concerned citizens who sounded suspiciously similar and shared identical talking points about government overreach. The sabotage attempts escalated too. Someone slashed my truck tires the night before the meeting, all four, which meant I'd need roadside assistance instead of just a spare. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was designed to make me miss my own presentation. Fortunately, the local veterans group had been expecting dirty tricks. They'd been quietly monitoring my property and caught the saboteur on camera, a private security contractor whose employment records traced back to Margaret's crisis management firm. "Ma'am," veteran leader Mike Rodriguez told me with grim satisfaction, "we've got her red-handed on witness intimidation and property destruction. Federal charges if we want to press them." But the most telling moment was when the community center's audio system mysteriously failed during the morning sound check. The venue manager, looking sheepish, explained that someone had accidentally damaged the main speakers during overnight cleaning. By now, Margaret's desperation reeked worse than stagnant water. She was throwing money at problems faster than a gambling addict, hiring lawyers, private investigators, crisis managers, and social media experts to fight a battle she was already losing. Her husband, Richard, started appearing at local businesses looking haggard and asking subtle questions about bankruptcy attorneys. Word was spreading that Margaret had taken out a second mortgage to fund her legal war chest, betting everything on crushing the boat problem before it destroyed their investment. The community was polarizing rapidly. Expensive homes displayed professional private property rights signs, while modest neighborhoods countered with handmade public access banners. Local businesses found themselves choosing sides, with window displays becoming political statements. But Margaret's biggest mistake was threatening Janet Rodriguez, the federal representative. During a chance encounter at the local coffee shop, Margaret made veiled threats about political consequences and federal budget cuts if the government proceeded with harassment of law-abiding citizens. What Margaret didn't know was that threatening federal officials is a felony, and Rodriguez had recorded the entire conversation on her government phone. The night before the community meeting, my cottage resembled a campaign headquarters under siege. Federal marshals had been assigned for security after the threats against Rodriguez. Local supporters brought casseroles and coffee, turning my property into an impromptu community center. Helen Peterson sat on my pier, sharing stories about the reservoir's history while her great-granddaughter played with minnows in the shallows. The contrast with Margaret's fortress-like mansion across the water couldn't have been more stark. "You know what the difference is between you and her?" Helen asked, watching Margaret's security lights sweep the shoreline like prison searchlights. "You're fighting for something bigger than yourself. She's just fighting to keep what she never really owned." As I reviewed my presentation one final time, the weight of federal documents solid in my hands, I could hear the gentle lapping of waves against my pier, the same sound Uncle Charlie had listened to for decades while protecting this place for future generations. Tomorrow, Margaret would learn that some fights choose you, whether you want them or not. The morning of the community meeting, I woke to find my property surrounded by supporters who'd camped overnight for protection. Veterans in lawn chairs formed a perimeter around my cottage, coffee mugs steaming in the pre-dawn chill. The sight reminded me of old war movies, except these soldiers were fighting for fishing rights instead of foreign territory. "Nobody's getting to you without going through us first," Mike Rodriguez announced, handing me a cup of coffee that tasted like liquid courage mixed with brotherhood. Across the reservoir, Margaret's mansion buzzed with activity. A convoy of black SUVs had arrived. During the night, her legal team, crisis managers, and what looked suspiciously like private security contractors. The smell of expensive desperation hung in the air thicker than morning mist. The pre-meeting drama started early. Margaret attempted to serve me with a restraining order, claiming I'd made terroristic threats against her property. The process, server looked embarrassed as Federal Marshal Johnson intercepted the paperwork and explained jurisdiction issues in terms that would make a law professor weep. "Ma'am, you can't serve state papers on someone acting under federal authority," Johnson told the server with patient authority. "That's like trying to arrest a postal worker for delivering mail." But Margaret's real desperation showed when she tried to pack the community center with outsiders. Buses arrived from the county seat filled with people who'd never seen Willowbrook Reservoir, all carrying identical property rights signs and talking points that sounded rehearsed. The acrid smell of diesel exhaust mixed with the perfume of hired protesters created an atmosphere thick enough to choke a fish. Local residents recognized the manipulation immediately. Nothing unites a small community faster than outsiders trying to manipulate their politics. The counter response was, "Beautiful. Pickup trucks and minivans converged on the community center from every direction, filled with families who'd lived here for generations. Inside the venue, the tension was thick enough to cut with a boat propeller. The community center, designed for maybe 200 people, somehow accommodated nearly 400 bodies packed like sardines. The ancient air conditioning wheezed like Uncle Charlie's old outboard motor, failing to combat the nervous energy radiating from the crowd. Margaret arrived in full corporate battle dress, power suit, perfect makeup, and a legal team that looked like they charged by the heartbeat. She commanded the front row like a general surveying a battlefield, her hired supporters arranged strategically throughout the crowd. The major twist came when several of Margaret's own homeowners publicly broke ranks. Richard Thornfield, Margaret's husband, stood up during the opening remarks and dropped a bombshell that made his wife's face go whiter than her Mercedes. "I want to formally distance myself from my wife's tactics," he announced, his voice shaking but determined. "We've mortgaged our future to fight a battle we can't win against rights we never actually possessed." The gasps from Margaret's section were audible. Her own husband had just publicly undermined her legal strategy in front of 400 witnesses and 3 news cameras. But Richard wasn't finished. "I reviewed the federal documents. Our property deed is worthless. We've been living on borrowed time and stolen land, and it's time to admit it." Margaret's face cycled through emotions faster than a slot machine. Shock, rage, betrayal, and, finally, cold calculation. She whispered furiously to her lead attorney, who looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. More homeowners began standing up, expressing frustration with Margaret's endless legal fees and assessments. The united front she'd claimed to represent was crumbling faster than a sandcastle at high tide. "We never signed up for a war," called out Mrs. Henderson from Oak Street. "We just wanted a nice place to retire, not to bankrupt ourselves fighting the federal government." The crowd's energy shifted dramatically. What had started as Margaret supporters versus Tom supporters was becoming Margaret versus everyone else, including her own neighbors. Federal Representative Rodriguez took detailed notes, her expression growing more serious as she documented each admission of fraudulent property claims. Every word spoken was potential evidence in federal court proceedings. Mayor Thompson struggled to maintain order as Margaret's hired protesters became increasingly agitated. Several were clearly intoxicated, shouting nonsensical slogans about constitutional rights and government tyranny. Their behavior contrasted sharply with the dignity of local residents sharing personal stories about the reservoir's history. The breaking point came when Margaret stood up and screamed at her own husband, calling him a traitor and threatening divorce proceedings. The sound of her voice, shrill with desperation, echoed off the community center walls like fingernails on a chalkboard. "You're all being manipulated by a bitter mechanic who can't accept that some people are more successful than others," she shrieked, pointing accusingly at me. That's when Helen Peterson, all 89 years of her, stood up with the kind of dignity that comes from a lifetime of weathering storms. "Honey," she said in a voice that carried to the back of the room, "success isn't measured by the size of your house, it's measured by how you treat your neighbors." The silence that followed was deafening. The moment had arrived. I stood at the podium, looking out at 400 faces, news cameras rolling, and Federal Marshal Johnson positioned strategically near the exit. The smell of nervous sweat and old coffee hung in the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "My name is Tom Mitchell, and I'm here to tell you the truth about Willowbrook Reservoir." I started simple: Uncle Charlie's stories, the community's history, the gradual privatization that stole public access from working families. The projector displayed old photos of summer festivals and children learning to swim where million-dollar docks now blocked the shoreline. But then came the mic drop moment. "What Margaret doesn't want you to know," I said, clicking to the next slide, "is that none of you actually own your reservoir properties. According to these federal documents, Willowbrook Reservoir has been owned by the United States government since 1971. As we sat on my pier going through her files, the sound of expensive boat engines echoed across the water from Margaret's evening yacht party. She had no idea that her own mortgage documents might be based on fraudulent ownership claims. "Here's A crucial legal principle most people don't know. Navigable waterways are often held in public trust. Private property owners can't legally restrict access to water that belongs to all citizens. Tomorrow, I was going to introduce Margaret to the concept of federal jurisdiction. My little cabin transformed into mission control overnight. Maps, federal, documents, and legal briefs covered every surface like paper snow. The coffee pot worked overtime as Dr. Wang's legal team, tribal representatives, and veterans group leaders gathered around my kitchen table that suddenly felt way too small for the magnitude of what we were planning. First priority, Dr. Wang announced, spreading out a timeline on yellowed paper, is filing the federal complaint before Margaret's lawyers can muddy the waters further. We need to establish Tom's legal standing as federal caretaker before they claim this is just another property dispute. The environmental lawyer had mapped out federal jurisdiction boundaries using GPS coordinates that proved most of the expensive homes sat partially on federal land. The evidence was overwhelming. Aerial photos, survey markers, historical documents that read like a legal thriller. But we weren't just building a case to destroy Margaret's community. We were crafting a solution that could protect innocent homeowners while restoring public access. Frank Peterson, the retired surveyor, had become our technical wizard. His weathered hands traced property lines with the precision of a surgeon, identifying exactly which structures could stay and which had to go. The smell of his perpetual cigarettes mixed with the aroma of fresh legal documents as he explained the boundaries to our growing coalition. "See, most folks bought these houses in good faith," Frank wheezed, pointing to property stakes on his detailed maps. "They got screwed by developers who knew damn well they were selling federal land. We can protect them if we're smart about." And the tribal council's historian, Maria Strong Bear, brought documentation showing the reservoir's significance as a traditional gathering place. Her research would strengthen our federal case while honoring the area's deeper history. She spoke quietly, but with authority that made everyone listen. "This water has been sacred to our people for 900 years. It was never meant to be owned by anyone." The veterans group, led by a former Army sergeant named Mike Rodriguez, handled security planning for the community meeting. These guys had seen enough overseas to recognize when civilians needed protection from bullies with money. "Margaret's desperate," Mike said, checking his notebook. "Desperate people do stupid things. We'll have plainclothes guys throughout the crowd plus official security at all entrances." I spent hours practicing my presentation with Dr. Wang, learning to explain complex legal concepts in terms regular folks could understand. The secret was breaking down the federal supremacy clause, environmental law, and public trust doctrine into bite-sized pieces that wouldn't put people to sleep. "Think of federal law like a basketball referee," Dr. Wang coached. "Local rules don't matter if they contradict the official rule book." Meanwhile, Margaret was mounting her own desperate counteroffensive. She'd hired a prestigious law firm from the state capital, the kind with marble lobbies and hourly rates that could fund small countries. Private investigators started sniffing around my background, looking for anything that could undermine my credibility. But Margaret made a crucial tactical error. Her investigation revealed Uncle Charlie's federal employment record, which her lawyers interpreted as evidence of government overreach rather than legitimate authority. They were preparing to argue that federal claims were invalid because the Cold War designation was obsolete. They had no idea they were about to walk into a legal buzzsaw. The breakthrough came when a federal representative from the Department of Interior agreed to attend our community meeting. Janet Rodriguez, a soft-spoken woman with 25 years of public lands experience, would provide official confirmation of the reservoir's federal status. "This case could set important precedent nationwide," she told me during our phone briefing. "We've been tracking illegal privatization of federal waters for years, waiting for the right case to make a stand. Our evidence packages were works of art, color-coded timelines, aerial photography comparisons, legal precedents, and financial impact studies. Each homeowner would receive a folder explaining their options and legal protections. The knowledge nugget that changed everything was understanding community land trusts, legal structures that can balance private home ownership with public access rights. Instead of destroying the community, we could restructure it as a model for sustainable development." As the community meeting approached, My cabin became a revolving door of supporters. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the nervous energy of people preparing for battle. Local business owners stopped by with encouragement, seeing tourism potential in restored public access. Families with children expressed excitement about affordable recreation opportunities. But the most moving moment came when elderly residents started sharing memories of the reservoir's community history. Helen Peterson, now 89, brought black and white photos of summer festivals and swimming lessons that made everyone misty-eyed. "The reservoir raised 4 generations of our children," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. About time it remembered who it really belongs to. The night before the meeting, I stood on my pier one last time as Tom, the simple mechanic. Tomorrow I'd become Tom, the federal steward, carrying Uncle Charlie's legacy into a fight that would define this community's future. Here's the thing about community organizing. When people unite around shared values instead of individual interests, they become unstoppable. Margaret's desperation was starting to show. Word had leaked about my legal research, and she was scrambling like a cat on a hot dock. Her first move was classic Margaret: throw money at the problem until it disappeared. She scheduled private meetings with county commissioners, arriving with briefcases full of what she called impact studies, but what looked suspiciously like thinly veiled bribes. Suddenly, the county received anonymous donations for new park equipment and road improvements, all coincidentally from Willowbrook Harbor Estates residents. But Margaret's real genius was her character assassination campaign. She started spreading rumors that I was unstable and potentially dangerous on the water. According to her whisper network, my bankruptcy had left me emotionally compromised, and my boat was a safety hazard to families enjoying their reservoir. The rumor mill worked overtime. Apparently, I'd been seen drinking beer while fishing. True, 1 beer with lunch. Shouting at innocent boaters. False, I told someone their wake was disrupting my line. And making threatening gestures. Also false, unless pointing at a fish counts as assault. Margaret organized a letter-writing campaign to state representatives, painting me as an outside agitator threatening their peaceful community. She even appeared on the local radio station's morning show, her voice dripping with concern for public safety and property rights. But then she crossed a line that changed everything. I woke up one morning to find my boat's engine wouldn't start. When I popped the hood, the sweet smell hit me immediately. Someone had poured sugar into my gas tank. Classic sabotage that turns fuel into syrup and destroys the engine from the inside. The really clever part? The security cameras that Margaret's HOA had installed around the reservoir mysteriously malfunctioned the same night. Amazing how technology fails right when you need it most. While I was dealing with my sabotaged engine, someone had also cut my dock lines. If I hadn't done my morning coffee ritual on the pier, my boat would have drifted into the rocks and been totaled by the morning waves. That's when I knew Margaret had stopped playing games and started playing for keeps. But she'd also given me something valuable, proof that her legal position was weak enough to require criminal tactics. Dr. Wang connected me with a broader network of allies I hadn't expected. The state environmental lawyer was just the beginning. Soon, I was talking to the local Native American Tribal Council, whose historical research showed the reservoir had been a gathering place for centuries before any European settlers arrived. The veterans group at the local American Legion rallied around what they saw as a classic case of the little guy getting crushed by corrupt wealth. These were guys who'd fought overseas to protect democracy, and they weren't about to let some entitled rich lady steal public resources at home. Even the Auto Mechanics Union offered pro bono repair work after word spread about the sabotage. Turns out working-class folks don't appreciate seeing one of their own targeted by trust fund bullies. But the real game-changer came when Dr. Wang's research team made a discovery that made my hands shake as I read the documents. The major twist was buried in federal archives from 1971. During the Cold War, Willowbrook Reservoir had been designated as a strategic water reserve under federal jurisdiction. The designation was classified and forgotten, but it had never been officially rescinded. The room erupted. Margaret's supporters shouted denials while her legal team frantically shuffled papers. But the evidence was undeniable. Official federal letterhead, GPS coordinates, employment records showing Uncle Charlie as the appointed federal caretaker. Margaret leaped to her feet, her perfectly groomed composure finally cracking completely. "This is a communist conspiracy," she screamed, pointing at the federal documents like they were radioactive. "You're all being manipulated by government agents trying to steal private property." That's when Federal Representative Rodriguez stood up and delivered the knockout punch. "Mrs. Thornfield, I'm Janet Rodriguez from the Department of Interior. These documents are authentic federal records. Your property deed is based on fraudulent claims and your mortgage was obtained under false pretenses." The silence that followed was broken only by the clicking of news cameras capturing Margaret's public meltdown in real time. But Rodriguez wasn't finished. "Furthermore, your threats against federal officials and attempts to obstruct this investigation constitute felony charges under federal law." Margaret's expensive legal team began quietly gathering their briefcases, clearly abandoning a sinking ship. Her crisis management experts huddled in frantic, whispered conferences, probably calculating how fast they could distance themselves from their client. The community's reaction was swift and decisive. Homeowner after homeowner stood up to denounce Margaret's deception and express support for a mediated solution that could protect their investments while restoring public access. "We were lied to by the developers," called out Jim Patterson from Lakeview Drive. "If Tom's offering to help us find a legal solution instead of destroying us, I'm listening." Even some of Margaret's hired protesters were backing toward the exits, clearly uncomfortable with the federal jurisdiction they'd stumbled into. Threatening local officials was one thing, but obstruction of federal proceedings was serious prison time. The media circus reached its peak when Sheriff Martinez approached the podium with official paperwork. The sound of his boots on the wooden floor echoed through the suddenly quiet room. "Margaret Thornfield," he announced formally, "you're under arrest for criminal harassment, vandalism, and threatening federal officials." The gasps from the crowd were audible as Martinez read Miranda rights to a woman who'd arrived that morning, expecting to crush a simple mechanic's dreams. The clicking of handcuffs provided a metallic punctuation to months of legal warfare. But the most powerful moment came when Helen Peterson slowly walked to the microphone, her cane tapping against the floor with each deliberate step. "70 years ago, my husband proposed to me on that reservoir's public dock," she said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the packed room. "Our children learned to swim in those waters. Our grandchildren caught their first fish from that shore." She paused, looking directly at the news cameras. "This reservoir doesn't belong to the government, and it sure doesn't belong to people with more money than sense. It belongs to the community that's loved it for generations." The spontaneous applause started slowly, then built like a wave breaking against the shore. People stood, clapped, cheered, and some openly wept as Helen's words captured what this fight had really been about. Federal Representative Rodriguez took the microphone for the official announcement that would make headlines statewide. Effective immediately, Willowbrook Reservoir is restored to full public trust status under federal jurisdiction. A mediation process will begin next week to address property rights while ensuring permanent public access. Margaret's final desperate attempt to rally support failed spectacularly. As deputies escorted her toward the exit, she turned back to scream at the crowd. "You'll all regret this when your property values collapse. This mechanic has destroyed everything we built." That's when I delivered my own mic drop line loud enough for every camera to capture. "Ma'am, we didn't destroy anything. We just gave it back to the people who actually owned it." The roar of approval from 400 voices was deafening. Children ran toward the windows facing the reservoir as symbolic barriers came down. Veterans saluted while families hugged and elderly residents wiped away tears of joy. Justice, it turned out, sounded exactly like a community celebrating the return of something they should never have lost. Here's a crucial legal principle most people don't know. Navigable waterways are often held in public trust. Private property. Owners can't legally restrict access to water that belongs to all citizens. Tomorrow I was going to introduce Margaret to the concept of federal jurisdiction. Margaret's response to my courthouse visit was swift and petty. She hired private security to patrol the reservoir perimeter, guys in golf carts with clipboards, who looked about as intimidating as mall security on vacation. Every 75 feet around the shoreline, new private property no trespassing signs appeared overnight like expensive weeds. But her masterstroke was calling the Marine Patrol. We have reports of suspicious watercraft activity, she told Officer Davis when he showed up at my pier. Possible trespassing and environmental violations. Davis was a decent guy who knew Uncle Charlie. He looked embarrassed as he explained the complaint while examining my boat registration and fishing license, both perfectly legal and current. Tom, I gotta ask, you causing any real problems out here? Just fishing, same as always, I said, holding up a small perch. Want to check my tackle box for weapons of mass destruction? Davis chuckled. Look, between you and me, this whole thing smells fishier than week-old bait. But I got to respond to complaints. Just keep your nose clean, okay? After he left, Margaret organized what she called a reservoir reclamation parade. 15 expensive boats, everything from sleek speedboats to floating party barges, formed a coordinated flotilla designed to make my life miserable. They circled my fishing spot like aquatic vultures, honking their horns and creating wakes that rocked my little boat like a cork in a washing machine. Margaret commanded the lead vessel, a pristine white cabin cruiser that probably cost more than most people's houses, filming everything with her phone while shouting legal threats over a bullhorn. This is your final warning. Remove your vessel immediately or face the full consequences of the law. The coordinated drone of 15 boat engines mixed with the stench of premium gasoline and the acrid smell of Margaret's righteous indignation. I just kept fishing, maintaining the kind of calm dignity that drives bullies absolutely crazy. But while Margaret was busy playing Admiral, I was digging deeper into the reservoir's history. The breakthrough came when I connected with Frank Peterson, Helen's nephew and a retired land surveyor, who'd worked the original boundary disputes back in the 1980s. Frank lived in a mobile home that smelled like cigarettes and old survey equipment, surrounded by maps that covered every inch of the county. Your uncle was a smart man, Frank wheezed, unrolling a detailed survey from 1974. See, most folks don't understand the difference between shoreline property and lakebed ownership. He traced the property lines with a pencil stub worn down to the eraser. These fancy houses, they own to the high water mark, but the actual lakebed, the water itself, and the navigation rights, that's a whole different legal animal. The major twist hit me like a cold wave. According to this environmental survey from 1976, Willowbrook Reservoir is classified as navigable waters under state jurisdiction, which means it's held in public trust regardless of who owns the surrounding land. Frank pulled out aerial photos showing the reservoir's historical features. See these markers? Public access points that were legally established in 1971. Look where they are now. My heart started pounding. Several of the most expensive docks, including Margaret's own private pier, were built directly over historically public access areas. You're telling me they've been illegally blocking public access for years? I'm telling you that your uncle's water rights might be more valuable than all their fancy houses combined. I spent the next week documenting everything. Every blocked access point, every illegally placed dock, every sign claiming private ownership of what might actually be public water. I used a waterproof camera to photograph GPS coordinates, matching them against Frank's historical surveys. The evidence was overwhelming. Margaret's entire private reservoir community was built on a foundation of questionable property claims and illegal access restrictions. But the best part? The County Environmental Office confirmed that navigable water laws are protected under state statute. Private property owners can't just decide to own the water, no matter how many lawyers they hire or how many threatening letters they send. I also discovered that several state environmental groups had been monitoring Willowbrook Reservoir for years, waiting for someone with legal standing to challenge the privatization scheme. The night before Margaret's security guards were scheduled to have my boat towed, I received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Lisa Wang, an environmental lawyer who specialized in public trust cases, knocked on my cabin door with a briefcase full of legal ammunition. Mr. Mitchell, I believe we have a lot to discuss about your uncle's legacy and the public's right to this reservoir.